Whispers from the Rock, the haunted history of Alcatraz Island. The group arrives on Alcatraz Island, and the protagonist is immediately struck by the eerie atmosphere. As they step off the ferry, they are greeted by the looming presence of the prison and the sound of waves crashing against the rocks. The protagonist notices that the island seems to be covered in a thick fog, adding to the already ominous feeling. As they make their way to the prison, the group passes by the abandoned guard towers and decaying buildings. The protagonist can't help but feel a sense of foreboding as they walk through the desolate landscape. When they finally reach the prison, they are greeted by a tour guide who takes them through the various cells and exhibits. As they explore the prison, the protagonist begins to notice strange noises and inexplicable occurrences. They hear whispers in the distance and feel a cold draft of air, even though the prison is closed off from the outside. The protagonist tries to brush it off, but they can't shake the feeling that they are being watched. The tour ends, and the group is left to explore the prison on their own. The protagonist wanders through the cell blocks, taking in the history and trying to ignore the feeling of unease. But as they turn a corner, they come face to face with a ghostly figure standing in front of them. The figure disappears just as quickly as it appeared, leaving the protagonist shaken and convinced that there is something haunting Alcatraz Island. The protagonist's experience with the ghostly figure leaves them unnerved, but they try to rationalize it. They convince themselves that it was just their imagination and continue to explore the prison. However, as they make their way through the cell blocks, they hear strange noises and footsteps echoing through the corridors. Suddenly, the lights flicker, and the protagonist is plunged into darkness. They fumble for their flashlight and turn it on, illuminating a ghostly figure standing just a few feet away from them. The figure is the same one they saw earlier, but this time it's more vivid, and the protagonist can make out more details. The figure is dressed in old-fashioned prison garb, and its eyes seem to glow in the dim light. The protagonist tries to back away, but the figure moves closer, reaching out as if to touch them. In a moment of terror, the protagonist turns and runs, not stopping until they are safely outside the prison walls. Shaken and scared, the protagonist can't shake the feeling that they have been visited by a ghost. They tell their friends about the encounter, but they are met with skepticism. However, the protagonist knows what they saw and can't shake the feeling that something is not right on Alcatraz Island. After their ghostly encounter, the protagonist becomes obsessed with learning more about the history of Alcatraz Island and its ghostly inhabitants. They spend countless hours researching the island's past and reading accounts of paranormal activity. Their research leads them to discover that Alcatraz was once a maximum security prison that housed some of the most dangerous criminals in the United States. Many prisoners were subjected to inhumane conditions, and some were even subjected to experiments in an attempt to reform them. The protagonist also learns about the many escapes attempted by prisoners, including the infamous escape of Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers in 1962, which was never solved. The escapees were presumed dead, but some believe that they may have survived and are still living in hiding. As the protagonist delves deeper into their research, they begin to uncover more stories of hauntings and ghostly encounters on the island. They learn about the ghost of Al Capone, who is said to haunt the prison's hospital wing, and the ghost of a guard who was killed during an escape attempt. Armed with this knowledge, the protagonist becomes determined to uncover the truth about the island's haunted past. They plan to spend the night on Alcatraz Island, hoping to have more encounters with the island's ghostly inhabitants and possibly uncover clues about the unsolved mysteries surrounding the prison. The protagonist and their friends arrive at Alcatraz Island as the sun begins to set. They make their way to the prison, passing through the same entrance that thousands of prisoners had walked through before them. The air is thick with an eerie silence that makes the protagonist's skin crawl. As they enter the prison, the group splits up, each going their own way to explore. The protagonist decides to head to the cell blocks, eager to learn more about the prisoners who had once called the cells home. As they make their way through the cells, the protagonist can't shake the feeling that they are being watched. They hear strange noises, and the shadows seem to move on their own. However, they continue to explore, driven by their desire to uncover the island's secrets. As they near the end of the cell block, the protagonist's flashlight begins to flicker. They try to turn it off and on, but it refuses to work. Suddenly, they hear a faint whisper coming from one of the cells. At first, they think it's just their imagination, but then they hear it again, louder this time. The protagonist edges closer to the cell, heart pounding in their chest. As they peer inside, they see a ghostly figure standing in the corner, staring at them with glowing eyes. The protagonist is frozen in fear as the figure approaches, reaching out to touch them. The protagonist manages to break free from the ghostly figure's grasp and runs down the cell block, heart racing. They soon realize that they are not alone. Other ghosts and spirits seem to be lurking in the shadows. As they make their way through the prison, the protagonist starts to feel like they are being led somewhere. They follow their instincts, eventually ending up in a dark room filled with old equipment. Suddenly, the room begins to shake, and the protagonist realizes that they are in the prison's old generator room. They see a figure in the corner, frantically working to turn on the generator. It's the ghost of a prisoner who had once worked in the room, and he seems to be trying to escape from the prison. The protagonist realizes that the ghost needs their help and rushes to assist him. Together, they manage to get the generator started, and the room is filled with light. Suddenly, a loud alarm begins to blare, and the prison's security measures are triggered. The protagonist and the ghost run through the prison, trying to evade the guards who are now chasing after them. They manage to make it to the roof, where they find a helicopter waiting for them. The ghost tells the protagonist to escape while they still can, and disappears into thin air. The protagonist climbs aboard the helicopter, heart racing as they take off from the island. As they fly away, they can't help but wonder what other secrets the island holds, and what other ghostly encounters they may have had if they had stayed longer. The protagonist manages to escape from Alcatraz Island, but they are deeply shaken by the ghostly encounters they experienced. They return home, unable to forget the haunting experiences they had on the island. As they try to come to terms with what happened, the protagonist begins to have strange dreams about the prisoners who had once been held on Alcatraz. In these dreams, the prisoners seem to be trying to tell them something, but the protagonist can't quite understand what it is. Desperate for answers, the protagonist decides to do some research on the prison's history. They discover that Alcatraz has a long and sordid past, filled with stories of violence and desperation. As the protagonist delves deeper into the history of the prison, they begin to uncover more secrets about the island. They learn about the prisoners who had been subjected to inhumane experiments and the guards who had used brutal tactics to maintain order. Despite the fear that still lingers within them, the protagonist decides to share their experiences with others. They hope that by speaking out, they can help shed light on the dark history of Alcatraz Island and honor the memories of the prisoners who had suffered there. In the end, the protagonist comes to accept that they may never fully understand the mysteries of Alcatraz, but they will always carry with them the lessons they learned and the haunting whispers from the rock. After some time has passed, the protagonist begins to feel drawn back to Alcatraz Island. Despite the fear and uncertainty that they experienced during their previous visit, they feel compelled to return and confront the ghosts that haunt the prison. The protagonist decides to make the trip back to the island alone, determined to face their fears and find closure. As they step off the boat and onto the shore of Alcatraz, they feel a sense of unease and anticipation. As they explore the abandoned prison, the protagonist senses a presence watching them. They hear the sounds of footsteps echoing in the empty halls and whispers in the darkness. However, this time, they are not as scared as before and are determined to uncover the truth behind the haunting. As the day turns into night, the protagonist's sense of unease intensifies. They feel as if they are being followed, and the whispers seem to grow louder and more persistent. However, the protagonist refuses to back down and continues to investigate. Suddenly, they come face to face with a ghostly apparition of a former prisoner. The ghostly figure beckons to the protagonist, and they follow it deeper into the prison, determined to uncover the truth. Despite the fear and uncertainty, the protagonist feels a sense of closure and relief as they finally uncover the truth behind the haunting of Alcatraz. They realize that the ghosts of the past will always be a part of the island's history, but they can finally move on from the haunting whispers from the rock. As the protagonist follows the ghostly apparition deeper into the prison, they begin to feel as if they are uncovering a long-hidden secret. They arrive at a cell that has been left untouched since the prison's closure, and the ghostly figure points to a hidden compartment in the wall. The protagonist opens the compartment and finds a diary hidden inside. As they begin to read it, they realize that it belonged to a former prisoner who had been wrongfully accused of a crime and imprisoned on Alcatraz. The diary tells the story of the prisoner's harsh treatment by the guards and the horrific conditions of the prison. As the protagonist continues to read, they realize that the prisoner had been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment, including being locked in solitary confinement for months at a time. They also learn that the prisoner had died in his cell, and his death had been covered up by the prison authorities. The diary provides a shocking revelation about the prison's history, and the protagonist realizes that the ghosts of Alcatraz are the restless spirits of former prisoners who were wrongfully imprisoned and treated cruelly. With this new knowledge, the protagonist feels a sense of empathy and understanding for the ghosts that haunt the prison. They vow to share the truth about the prison's dark past and ensure that the prisoners' stories are never forgotten. As the protagonist continues to read the diary, they come across a plan for an escape attempt that had been thwarted by the guards. The plan involved digging a tunnel out of the prison, and the protagonist realizes that the tunnel might still exist. Following the instructions in the diary, the protagonist makes their way to the basement of the prison, where they find the entrance to the tunnel. As they enter the tunnel, they hear ghostly whispers and footsteps behind them, but they continue on, determined to uncover the truth. As they emerge from the tunnel, the protagonist finds themselves on a secluded beach on the outskirts of San Francisco. The ghostly apparition that had been leading them through the prison appears once again, and the protagonist realizes that it was the spirit of one of the prisoners who had attempted to escape through the tunnel. The ghostly figure leads the protagonist to a boat that had been left behind by the prisoners who had attempted the escape. The protagonist climbs aboard the boat, and with a sudden gust of wind, the boat sets sail, leaving Alcatraz behind. As the boat sails towards the city, the protagonist feels a sense of freedom and liberation, as if they have escaped from the prison themselves. They realize that the ghosts of Alcatraz had been trying to communicate with them all along, and that they had been chosen to uncover the truth about the prison's dark past. The protagonist arrives back in San Francisco with a newfound sense of purpose. They are determined to share the truth about the haunted history of Alcatraz Island and the injustices that took place within its walls. Armed with the diary and the memories of the ghostly encounters they had on the island, the protagonist sets out to uncover the truth about the prison's past. They visit libraries, archives, and historical societies, poring over old newspapers, government documents, and first-hand accounts from former prisoners and guards. Through their research, the protagonist discovers that the prison had been rife with corruption, abuse, and mistreatment of prisoners. They uncover evidence of inmates being subjected to cruel and inhumane punishment, including being thrown into the hole, a dark, isolated cell, for days on end. The protagonist also learns about the infamous Battle of Alcatraz in 1946, when a group of prisoners attempted to take control of the prison. The resulting battle left several people dead and many injured, and the protagonist realizes that this event could have contributed to the paranormal activity on the island. As the protagonist shares their findings with the world, they receive both praise and criticism. Some are skeptical of their ghostly encounters, while others are shocked and horrified by the prison's dark past. But the protagonist remains resolute in their mission to shed light on the truth and to honor the spirits of those who suffered within Alcatraz's walls. The protagonist feels a strong urge to return to Alcatraz Island and confront the spirits that had haunted them during their previous visit. They make their way back to the island, this time with a different sense of purpose. As they walk through the empty corridors and cell blocks, they feel a strange energy coursing through the air. The protagonist makes their way to the solitary confinement cells, where they had encountered the ghostly figure of a former prisoner during their last visit. They stand in the darkness, calling out to the spirits, asking them to reveal themselves. Suddenly, they hear a whispering sound, as if someone is speaking directly into their ear. They turn around, but no one is there. The whispering grows louder and more urgent, and the protagonist feels a cold breath on their neck. Terrified, the protagonist begins to back away, but then they see the figure of a man materializing in front of them. It is the ghostly prisoner they had encountered before, and he is reaching out to them with a pleading expression. The protagonist realizes that the spirits are trying to communicate with them, to share their stories, and to seek justice for the injustices that took place within the prison walls. With a newfound sense of courage, the protagonist listens intently to the spirits' whispers, determined to help them find peace. After their encounter with the ghostly prisoner, the protagonist becomes obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the haunted history of Alcatraz Island. They begin to research the prison's past, poring over old documents and historical accounts. As they dig deeper, they discover shocking truths about the brutal conditions that prisoners endured in the maximum security facility. They read about the infamous hole, a pitch-black cell where prisoners were sent for weeks on end without food or water. They learn about the sadistic guards who took pleasure in tormenting the inmates, and the corrupt warden who turned a blind eye to the abuse. The protagonist realizes that the spirits of Alcatraz are not just restless souls, but the voices of those who were wronged and forgotten by history. They feel a deep sense of responsibility to share their findings with the world and to give the ghosts the justice they deserve. With their research complete, the protagonist prepares to leave the island, but before they go, they make one final stop. They return to the solitary confinement cells, where they once again feel the energy of the spirits surrounding them. They speak to the ghosts, promising to tell their stories and to ensure that their voices are heard. As they leave the island, the protagonist feels a sense of closure and purpose. They know that the ghosts of Alcatraz will never rest completely, but they hope that their work will bring some measure of peace to those who suffered within its walls. The protagonist returns to the mainland, haunted by their experiences on Alcatraz Island. They struggle to make sense of the ghosts they encountered and the history they uncovered. They find it difficult to focus on their daily life, as their mind continually returns to the haunted prison. As they try to move on, they receive an unexpected invitation. A journalist who heard about their experiences on Alcatraz Island invites them to appear on a popular podcast about ghosts and hauntings. At first, the protagonist is hesitant, but they realize that this is their chance to share their findings with a wider audience. They agree to the interview and share their experiences with the journalist and their listeners. The response is overwhelming, as people from all over the world reach out to share their own ghost stories and to express their gratitude for the protagonist's work. The protagonist finds a new sense of purpose in this unexpected aftermath. They become a spokesperson for the ghosts of Alcatraz, sharing their story and calling for justice for those who suffered within its walls. They continue to investigate other haunted sites, hoping to shed light on the past and to give voice to the spirits that still roam the earth. As they embrace their new role, the protagonist realizes that their encounters on Alcatraz Island were not just a haunting, but a calling. They are grateful for the opportunity to bring the ghosts to light and to help them find peace. As the group ventures further into the prison, they begin to hear strange whispers and feel cold spots. They eventually reach the infirmary, where they see a figure in a nurse's uniform. As they approach, the figure disappears, but they hear a faint voice saying, "Get out of here." Suddenly, the door slams shut, and the group realizes they are trapped. They hear footsteps approaching, and they quickly realize that they are not alone. They turn around to face a group of ghostly figures, including the notorious Al Capone. The ghosts begin to move closer, and the group is filled with terror. But then, one member remembers the advice from the tour guide and pulls out a small vial of holy water. They quickly douse the ghosts with the water, and the figures begin to dissipate. As the group escapes the infirmary and makes their way back to the ferry, they feel a sense of relief and accomplishment. They know that they have confronted the ghosts of Alcatraz and emerged victorious. The group cautiously made their way towards the source of the whispers, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they turned a corner, they saw a figure in the distance. It was a tall, shadowy figure with glowing eyes. They froze, unsure of what to do next. Suddenly, the figure began to move towards them, slowly at first, then with increasing speed. The group tried to run, but it was too late. The figure was upon them, and they could feel its icy breath on their faces. Just as all hope seemed lost, one of the group members remembered the silver cross they had found earlier. With a trembling hand, they pulled it out and held it up towards the figure. To their surprise, the figure recoiled in fear, its glowing eyes dimming. Seizing the opportunity, the group sprinted past the figure towards the exit. As they emerged from the building, they were greeted by the warm rays of the sun and the sight of the San Francisco skyline in the distance. Looking back at Alcatraz, they knew they had faced their fears and conquered the island's haunted past. But as they walked away, they couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers they had heard were still echoing in their minds, a reminder of the horrors they had faced.